So, Rabbi, when I Googled this, it looked like the trachea was almost a collarbone. Am I wrong?
The collarbone?
It seems
Yes,
like it's
that is not correct. The collarbone is this part here on the shoulders,
all right.
right? It's right here, going from the shoulder towards the top of the rib cage.
Right.
The trachea is the windpipe that goes through the neck. I mean, it eventually branches and goes into the lungs, and of course, eventually connects with the esophagus and comes out through the mouth and through the nose. But the part that we're talking about with the rings is right here. Sorry, let me tilt my throat back further. Is right here in that section of the neck. And again, don't be afraid to feel and press. It doesn't actually hurt as long as you're not being like, stupid hard. You can feel the ribs of the trachea right there. That's the area they're talking about. And then we have the counter opinion. Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Yehuda, says, if there was only left towards the head a hairbreadth of the greater part of its circumference, then the slaughtering is valid. So he is more lenient. He says as long as at least half at the front of the slaughter is still there, then that's okay. But if it's more than half that is missing, then it's not okay. So he is willing to say as long as you began in the right place and got most of the right place, then it's okay. But the general opinion is that no, it needs to be through the entire diameter of the cross cut of the trachea. You need to be going through the ring at least a little bit. I did try to look for some pictures of this, and I couldn't come up with any great diagrams. I've got a better picture of the top-down view, showing the trachea here, and then the esophagus in the middle, and then the jugular veins and the carotid arteries, and the spinal column and the muscle around it. But unfortunately, this doesn't show me a good sideways view of the windpipe. But it was the best I can come up with, and later on we'll need this diagram anyway. So hopefully that gives you a basic idea of what a cross section of the neck looks like. And the idea is that if the cut comes across, that the cut needs to get all of that ring, the hard ring. And then Rabbi Yossi ben Yehuda said that it needed to only get half of that hard ring, half or more. But the general opinion is the one that stands. Need to get all of the ring. Now, again, all of this, as is much of our conversation in Chullin in general, is what we would call b'diavad, that this is after the fact. Ideally, lehatchila, from the outset, you should be aiming to cut it in a way that doesn't leave any doubt at all, that you're not dealing with hair's breadths of tissue remaining. But if you've cut it and the knife has moved in this way and there's only this much left, then if there's at least a little all the way around, it is kosher. And if not, then it isn't kosher, even if everything else that was in the slaughter was correct. Okay. Mishnah number 4. And this is where we're going to begin to talk a little bit about birds, which are slightly different. Animals are slaughtered and sacrificed by having their throats slit. Non-sacrificial birds are also slaughtered in this manner, meaning if you just have your dove that you're going to have for dinner, you would slaughter them in the same way. Well, mostly the same way. However, sacrificial birds, that is to say birds that are offered on the altar, are slaughtered by a process called nipping, which is done from the back of the neck. For more information, see Zvachim 6.4. So this Mishnah is going to compare the difference between how we would slaughter with a shochet, with an actual food slaughter, and how we would slaughter in the way of nipping for the altar. If one cut at the side of the neck, the slaughtering is valid, meaning if the knife began to cut from the side, as long as everything else went right, then that slaughtering can still be valid. If one nip,
the animal need to die immediately.
What's that?
The animal need to die immediately.
Well,
that's the bottom line.
Okay, so let's
How many seconds?
Okay, so yes and no, which you're going to get so sick and tired of hearing me say. Natan is asking, but the animal has to die immediately, right? And the answer is yes, the animal should die immediately, meaning that because of the way the trachea and the esophagus are set together, and because of the way the arteries and veins are set together, that this slice, if done properly, will cause dramatic and immediate blood loss from the brain, which will render the animal unconscious and will result in the animal essentially being dead almost immediately. However, as we will eventually discuss and in more detail later on, but it's important to go ahead and mention it now, if everything was done correctly, but for some reason the animal did not die immediately, the kosher slaughter is still kosher, right? You don't actually, according to the strict interpretation of halakha, you don't need the animal to die immediately. Now, 999 times out of 1,000, if you're doing kosher slaughter correctly, the animal is going to lose consciousness and slip into death immediately. But if you do everything right, there is still a chance that the animal will not exhibit death as quickly as one might like. But that doesn't mean it's not kosher. It just means that for whatever reason, the way this animal's heart was pumping and the way it was finishing off its life took longer than usual. And that doesn't invalidate the slaughter. We often focus on the effect of the slaughter, the death of the animal, the painlessness of the animal, the speed with which it's slaughtered, as being the goal. And technically, it is a secondary goal, meaning that this is a form of slaughter which is very good at achieving all of those things. A painless and quick death for the vast majority of the animals that are slaughtered properly. However, that is technically a secondary goal, meaning that if that goal is not met, if for some reason this animal seems to take longer, even seems to suffer, as long as every other condition of the kosher slaughter was done properly, then the meat from that animal is still considered kosher. So that's how we know it's a secondary concern, because it doesn't invalidate the slaughter, even if the passing doesn't happen as immediately as we would like, or even if the animal showed signs of distress that didn't invalidate it for any other reasons, which we will eventually cover. So yes, almost all the time, this will cause near instantaneous loss of life, consciousness, and death. But technically, that's not required, which, as I said, can be a little surprising because we often focus on those other goals, because most of us are more interested in the animal than we are about the technicalities of the slaughter. The Mishnah is more interested in making sure we understand the technicalities of the slaughter in order that we will also ensure the secondary goals of a swift and mostly pain-free death for the animal.
Now, Rabbi, how immediately is immediately for the Mishnah? Immediately is 1 second, 2, 3 seconds. Because why is my question? I learned that in the seconds before the death, there's some blood or something that they excrete by the animals that make the meat harder, and the acids are the unhealthy one, those acids. So that's why I ask. My question is, how immediately is in general in the 99.9% of the cases, how many seconds is immediately for in a kosher slaughter?
Well, again, the immediacy is not it's not a criteria for kashrut. So they don't actually stand with a stopwatch to make sure it's valid. But from what I understand, on average, an animal that is slaughtered in a kosher way will usually have lost consciousness within like 5 to 10 seconds, and will have had their heart will have stopped within a minute at the longest on average. but it's the consciousness that's usually considered to be the goal, because and as a secondary act, I should also point out, although again, this is not technically a requirement, as a secondary act, this of course does also facilitate the draining of the blood from the animal, which, as we'll see, is a very important part of kashrut as well. It's not a primary goal, but it is a benefit of this form of slaughter. Yes, Aaron?
Hey, Rabbi, just out of curiosity, I remember before we talked about if meat was not kosher, you could still sell it. You just couldn't eat it as long as you weren't selling it to Jews, right?
Correct. The prohibition on kosher food, and this particular type of kosher food, kosher meat, let's be precise, is to not eat it. But a Jew is allowed to sell non-kosher food. That is permitted. And in fact, when we talk later on about the Gid Hanashe, the sciatic nerve tissue that we don't eat in commemoration of Jacob's struggle, in the European areas, it became commonplace to simply remove the back half of the cow or other animals and sell them to non-Jews, rather than fight with the dissection needed to remove that portion of the animal. In the Muslim world, that did not become customary, but that's why you often don't find cuts of meat from that part of the animal in Ashkenazic butchers.
Right.
And
So if you mess up the stuff, you could still sell it. You're not just throwing away an animal for no reason, right?
Well, yes, as long as you have a buyer. If you mess up your slaughter and it's not a kosher slaughter, or there's some other problems with the animal that are discovered once you have begun its butchering, then you can sell it to somebody for whom those are not issues, meaning to a non-Jew. That is permitted.
And can you give this to your animals in no kosher food also?
Yes, you can also, specifically it's mentioned for dogs, but yes, you can feed a nevela, which is an animal that died from an improper death, to your dogs, for example, as well. So you are allowed to benefit from it, as opposed to certain other things. For example, chametz on Passover, we're not allowed to benefit from in any way, shape, or form. The mixing of meat and milk, we're not allowed to benefit from in any way, shape, or form. But kosher meat versus non-kosher meat, in this case, yes, technically you don't have to throw it away. You just can't eat it.
I don't have now an example in mind, okay, but the problem there is, what about if I have an animal that eat meat, okay, and I give that kosher, not kosher meat? Can I eat that animal later? Also, if I provide that animal not kosher meat, yes, correct, because it's like in nature, it's like being in the nature.
Right. So one of my favorite types of food is duck. I discovered in Baltimore, actually, at the kosher Chinese restaurant there, David Chu's, which was absolutely amazing, and I still wish I could teleport to Baltimore just to visit them. But I learned that I liked duck. It wasn't something I'd eaten much as a kid, but I grew up with ducks around. My grandmother raised ducks for most of her life, and if you've ever watched a duck eat, you know that ducks are not eating kosher food. Ducks eat every bug, snail, worm that you could possibly imagine, but they are still kosher food. It's not a question of what the animal eats. It's a question of what the animal is. If it's a kosher species, then whatever it has eaten, when you eat it, it's fine. If it's a non-kosher species, even if you fed it the most pure grain, never touched anything, it doesn't make the animal kosher. It's not about some transformation of what it eats into its flesh. It's about the characteristics of the animal that make it kosher in and of itself, as those characteristics are lined up in the Torah, which we can really see in practice here, because here for shechita, as we're talking about, you can have a perfect animal, the most 100% kosher cow ever imagined, and if you mess up the slaughter just by an extra eighth of an inch, it's now trash. You can't eat it. So it's not about what the animal ate or didn't eat. It's about what type of animal it is. Aaron, hand up.
Yes, Rabbi. If you mess up the slaughtering where you don't get the trachea, that animal is now nevela, right?
That's nevela. It's not kosher. It's just a carcass.
But there's a difference between nevela and trephis. But trephis means something besides the slaughtering was defective, right?
Okay, so yeah, we're going to talk about treifa in a lot more detail later on. Treif, as the introduction from this wonderful translation explained, is used now casually in American English especially to just mean not kosher, but it actually has a technical meaning. And the technical meaning is that it is suffering from a mortal wound. For example, it has been torn by a wolf or a lion, but it isn't dead yet. Even if the sheep, for example, that had been bit by a wolf and that was bleeding, even if it was alive and you quickly grabbed it and did kosher slaughter on it, you could still not eat it. It's not kosher, even though it died from your knife, not from its wound, because it was suffering from the wound. It's not kosher. But we'll go into that in a lot more detail in later chapters. All right, so back to our slaughtering versus nipping. Slaughtering on the side is okay. Again, that doesn't mean that it should necessarily be the perfect thing, but some argue about whether it should or shouldn't be your way to do it. But if you did, it's okay. But if you nipped the head from the side of the neck, then that nipping is invalid, right? The side of the neck, as he points out, is valid for slaughter, but not for nipping. And that is the distinction between these two. Another distinction in part 3 on this page, if one cut at the back of the neck, meaning for slaughter, the slaughtering is invalid, meaning if you put the knife here and went through, even if you cut everything else correctly, it's not kosher. But if one nipped the head off from the back of the neck, then the nipping is valid, right? In fact, that's the way you're supposed to do the nipping, is to start at the back and go forward. In case you're wondering how this nipping worked, I'll give you just a very, very brief insight. The Kohanim would grow an extra long fingernail to be able to have it sharp to slice through the neck. And they would literally just sort of like tear the head off by using the fingernail as the knife. But that would go from the back of the neck. Also distinctive between them, if one cut at the front of the neck, the slaughtering is valid, which we talked about for standard slaughtering at the beginning of the Mishnah. If one nipped off the head from the front of the neck, the nipping is invalid. So even though both methods end up with the bird being dead, if you do it the wrong way, it's going to be either not kosher or not fit for the altar. And in fact, what works for the altar is exactly what doesn't work for kosher food. And what works for kosher food is exactly what doesn't work for the altar. Now, this is just a pause here just for the quick realization, discussion, philosophy, whatever you want to call it. This is one of the places where it's important to understand theologically that the particular way that kashrut is carried out does not necessarily reflect some underlying magical lines of spirit running through the animal. If it did, then having two 180-degree opposite ways of doing a kill would mean that one of them had to be wrong. But it's not a question of it being wrong. It's a question of, is it wrong or right for this occasion, for this need? And that's what we're seeing here. That if you're using it for the altar, you do it the way the Torah describes the altar sacrifice. If you're doing it for your table, you do it the way the Torah describes the the slaughter for your table. And both are right and both are correct for the purpose for which you are doing it. And you shouldn't think, if it's good enough for the altar, it's how I should do it for my table. Or if it's good enough for the table, it's how I should do it for the altar. You have to do the right way for the right moment, not just what you feel like. Yes, Natan.
Why did how to slaughter? Because in the Torah there's no description in scripture how to slaughter. That's
Okay.
The Mishnah. why they create two different one and not use the same for both occasions?
I couldn't quite hear the.
Why did they create two different versions of slaughter, depending if it's for a ritual or for food, or for the temple or for
Right.
and why they didn't create just one for everything? Because the goal is the same. For example, with a cow it's difficult, but with a bird it's easy to kill anyway from front or back. You can cut everything.
Right.
So why two different and not use the same one?
So the rabbis didn't believe they were creating two different versions of slaughter. The rabbis believed that their analysis of the Torah and the continued chain of tradition, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral tradition, meant that these were what the Torah meant. When the Torah said slaughter, it meant from the front. And when the Torah said nipping, it meant from the back. That was simply the way they read the verses as indicating. So they weren't trying to come up with alternative methods. They were trying to follow what they understood the text to be saying and also reinforce what they knew from the accepted practice that they had inherited. So they weren't starting from scratch, is what I mean. They had the Torah to work with, and they had the oral tradition to work with. And the interpretation of the Torah that was received was slaughter in the front, nipping at the back. I know that's not satisfying because we want it to be obvious in the text in a way that doesn't require accepting the rabbinic interpretation. But ultimately, that's not how textual readings work. Ultimately, everything is subject to the received interpretation that is also measured by our logic and reason and analysis. And this is what emerges. Now, you can always read Sifra, the selection of halachic midrashim on the book of Vayikra, in particular, to get a lot more information about the way the rabbis derive each of these different steps from different verses. However, the Mishnah doesn't usually spend a lot of time recounting those derivations. The Mishnah usually focuses on how to actually do it correctly, assuming that those derivations are, of course, correct. But we could always set aside some time to go through the midrash to show the verse by verse, word by word origin for the different aspects. But it's still going to eventually require accepting that this is the way the rabbis read it. And yes, I fully understand and agree that different readers without that benefit or without that baggage, depending upon your perspective, might come to a different set of conclusions. Aaron?
Yes, Rabbi. Was there anything in the commentary that talked about why there was a complete 180 between the ritual and non-ritual? Is because they wanted the ritual to be distinct from the non-ritual?
Certainly that is a side effect of this, is that it does mean that the ritual is very different than the slaughter for food. But again, it wasn't a decision of doing it this way. Now, if that is why the Torah wanted to have it done this way, which the rabbis believe they are interpreting, then that would be a potential explanation for why the Torah gave us the instruction to make them reversed. But it's just not the rabbis that wanted it. It would be the Torah, or by extension, God, that wanted it. Let's go ahead and finish off the Mishnah, just so we can see this pattern play out to its conclusion. For the whole of the back of the neck is the appropriate place for nipping, and the whole of the front of the neck is the appropriate place for slaughtering. It follows, therefore, that the place which is appropriate for slaughtering is inappropriate for nipping, and the place which is appropriate for nipping is inappropriate for slaughtering. This is a summary of the general idea of A doesn't equal B. Therefore, if A is okay for the first situation, then B is not okay. And if B is okay for the second situation, then A is not okay. That it's just trying to make sure you understand that these are opposite activities. Now, to get you really riled up, since this seems to be an interesting sticking point, Mishnah 5 is going to give us another set of things that are different between the slaughter and the nipping, where we have these opposite situations. So we're going to continue on with that issue here in Mishnah 5. The age which disqualifies turtle doves for sacrifices, and this is why you have to read it carefully. The age which qualifies turtle doves for sacrifice disqualifies pigeons, and the age which qualifies pigeons disqualifies turtle doves. That is, turtle doves are valid as sacrifices when they're older, and pigeons when they are younger. There is no overlapping period when both are valid. Once a turtle dove is old enough that had it been a pigeon, it would be valid. It is, once a pigeon is old enough that had it been a turtle dove, it would be valid. It is no longer valid as a sacrifice as a pigeon, and vice versa. If you have a young turtle dove, that would be fine if it were a pigeon. That means it is not able to be sacrificed because turtle doves are sacrificed when older. Yes, Natan.
So, Rabbi, I'm there in the previous Mishnah because I try to understand three concepts that they say here in my translation, and I try to see in Hebrew the word, and I don't see the difference. Like you say, what is melika?
Oh, that's the nipping that they're talking about. That's the. Hold on a second. I'll just bring up the Hebrew so that people can know what we're talking about here. So the word that we're talking about here is molek, right? That's the word that's being translated in the English that we're using as nipping. It could also be translated as pinching, pinch. Because literally what would happen would be the Kohen would have a very sharp nail, and he would hold the bird, and he would grab the head and basically squeeze the sharp nail through the neck and remove the head.
So that's pinch.
That's pinch. That's milika.
Molek.
Right,
So
molek, milika, right.
Because here say shochet mina oref, shochet mina tzavar. So there's not like, so it's still the same verb, shochet. So you say that we know when it's from the front or from the back by the if it's in English nip or is slaughtering. But when I go to the Hebrew, I cannot see.
Okay, so wait, what was repeat the Hebrew phrase that you were referring to?
They use the same verb, shochet. Shochet mina oref, that means from here.
Right.
And shochet mina tzavar. Tzavar is the...
Right, but that's whenever this Mishnah is using the term shochet, it means slaughtering the animal for food.
So shochet is for food?
Yes.
Only?
Only. And molek is only for the altar, for sacrifices, korban. So if you are trying to turn it into food, and you do the shrita from the oref, from the back of the neck, right? Then that is not kosher. That is, as it says, pasula, right? That is pasul. It is not going to be a kosher slaughter. And if you do the shrita from the savar, right, from the throat, right, from the front, then that is keshera. That is kosher. And they use the opposite word molek when trying to talk about the pinching, right? So it's whenever it says shochet, it's talking about making something food. And whenever it says molek, it's talking about making something a korban, about making it a sacrifice.
So let me see if I understood what is it, pinch or nip.
Yes.
Just you put, instead to be shochet with a knife like that, you just go like cross, like a break.
Without the breaking, it's slicing. Imagine, I'm trying to think of anything we do that's similar to this motion in the modern world. What would that be? Have something sticking up and you need to scrape off. Okay, here we go. All right, maybe. Right. Imagine you have a candle. Right, and the candle, you used it last week for something, and now you want to clean up the top of the candle. You want to get rid of the wick, the little bit sticking out, but you don't have a scissors sitting around, but you do have a really long fingernail. So you just take the fingernail and you slice off the top. Right, you just pull your nail across it. So it's like it's not like your nail is a knife, like a little guillotine, just pulling it off. But because you're holding it on the other side, right, it's like you're pinching it. You're like making a pinching movement. So sort of imagine, here, we got
because
right, this is
side and you cut it this way.
Right, this is the, let me get that in the camera, right? This is the neck of whatever it is, right? So I put my hand over the top, right? So it's like that. And I got let me twist there. My thumbnail is against the back of the neck, right? And then I, like that against, there we go, camera, twill, right? And I would slice. Actually, let's try it this way. I would slice, right? It's just that slicing movement across the back. It's almost like bringing a knife across the back of the bird's neck.
So what the movement, the action is very similar to when you shochet mishu.
Well, exactly, but it is the opposite direction, right? Shochet's from the front going back, and milika is going from the back going front.
But the move is the same move.
Roughly, yes. The motion is the same.
The motion is the same.
Yes.
And the tools are the same tools.
Well, no. Usually, if you're preparing the food, preparing it for food, doing shchita, then you use a knife, or one of the other implements we looked at in the first two Mishnahs, in Mishnah 2, I believe it was.
Yeah, the stone and the
right. Exactly. But nowadays, it would always be a knife.
But molek could be what?
Your finger.
Really, that is enough to make this kosher.
They would have a sharp. They had a sharp nail, but that was enough to make it okay for the korban, for the sacrifice. But you couldn't do that to make dinner.
So the expectation from God are lower than for the human.
Well, that's your judgment call.
No, if it's more serious, the shkita, you need a better knife, and the other one is okay with the finger, with the.
Yeah, but whoa. So that's one way to look at it. But you could also say that the expectation is for the altar is that it needs to be done promptly and quickly in order to not delay the actual performance of the sacrifice. And doing it, makes it much faster. You don't have to go find a knife and spread the neck and get under the feathers and all of that. It's just done. Because you don't want to wait for doing the korban.
And the molek is only with the nail.
Yes.
Only with the nail, not with any other instrument.
So as our good friend Rabbi Kulp mentioned, what was it? Zvachim 6:4. The section about sacrifices will give you a lot more about milika if you want to go get more information on it.
Okay. Thank you.
Aaron?
Yes, right. Just out of curiosity, the word muluk doesn't come from the word mul, meaning opposite, does it?
I don't think so, because that would not include the kuf.
All right.
Usually, if it's a similarly derived word, it would have all of the shorashim, the root letters. All right. So we just jumped into Mishnah 5. Let's go ahead and push on a little bit more. We talked about how the age doesn't overlap, that there is a window for pigeons, which is young, and a window for turtle doves, which is older. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's like 1 year and then like 2 years that they are supposed to be. Also, at the period when the neck feathers begin to turn yellow in either kind, they are disqualified. So there is a time when both of them cannot be used during the similar situation. That is to say, when the neck feathers begin to turn yellow. As he explains, when the young bird hits 3 months, their feathers begin to fall off. If you've ever had a baby chick, you know that baby chicks start with those sort of yellowish feathers, and then they begin to change. Well, first from the body and then from the neck and head. Once all their babies have fallen off, they get new adult feathers. The new feathers on the head are at first yellow in appearance. So they're getting adult feathers, but the adult feathers are still the chick yellowish color. However, once this yellowish color has appeared, the birds are no longer considered to be young, but they are also not considered to be old, because eventually that yellow color will also go away. So, and be replaced by the regular color of whatever the bird's neck and head is. So once it goes yellow, you know that it's no longer young, so it can't be used as a pigeon. And also it's not old enough, so it can't be used as a turtle dove sacrifice, which means the bird for that window of time is perfectly safe, right? All of the birds know that when their head is yellow, neither of them can get sacrificed. One because it's too old and one because it's too young, but they're both safe during that window. So even though everything else is opposite, on this they agree. On this they are there is an overlap.
It's 3 months.
Well, it depends on the individual bird. It happens usually around 3 months that they begin to change their feathers. But for the turtle doves, which will eventually get adult feathers, adult colored feathers, then once that happens, they are okay to be used for sacrifices. This is, of course, one of the ways that you would know how old different birds were, because you wouldn't necessarily have them, show their ID. They couldn't tell you what their birthday was. All right, since we started late, let's go ahead and see if we can't do a little bit more. We're going to do more opposites, and we're going to go into a wider range of topics. We're not going to go down the rabbit hole of all of these topics, because otherwise there would be too much to discuss, but let's get a feel for the general pattern. The method of killing, which renders the red cow, that is to say the para aduma, which is the red heifer, valid, renders the heifer invalid. And this is the agla arufa, the cow that has its head hit in the back from the unknown murder. And the method which renders the heifer valid renders the red cow invalid. Right? So the red cow is used for the purificatory offering. This is the one that we do when someone has come in contact with the dead. And it is slaughtered by shrita, by having its neck sliced, the same way as all sacrificial animals are slaughtered. The heifer, on the other hand, is the calf that is killed when a corpse is found and we don't know who the murderer is. So the heifer is killed by having its neck chopped from behind. And this is in Deuteronomy 21, if you want to look it up. One cannot slaughter the red cow by chopping, and you can't slaughter the heifer by slicing. Part 2, the disability which does not disqualify priests does disqualify Levites, and the disability which does not disqualify Levites does disqualify priests. What does that mean? Levites can serve in the temple from the age of 20 to 50, as it says in the book of Bamidbar, chapter 4. In contrast, priests can serve in the temple from the time they reach the majority age, bar mitzvah, basically 13, and they can continue as long as they want. There's no mandatory retirement age. In that sense, the age which disqualifies Levites does not disqualify priests. On the other hand, priests who have certain physical blemishes cannot serve in the temple. And there's more about that in the 7th chapter of Bechorot in the Mishnah. But those blemishes do not disqualify the Levites. So a Levite could have a blemish that would mean that he couldn't serve if he were a Kohen, but he is allowed to serve because he's not a Kohen. And a Kohen could reach an age which would allow him to serve, but if he were a Levite, it wouldn't. But he's not a Levite, so it's okay. Right? They are not identical. Part 3, that which cannot be rendered unclean in earthenware vessels can be rendered unclean in all other vessels. And that which cannot be rendered unclean in all other vessels can be rendered unclean in earthenware vessels. That is to say, when something impure enters the airspace of an earthenware vessel, it is rendered impure. However, if it touches the outside of the vessel is pure. Earthenware is like clay. In contrast, other vessels are rendered impure when something touches them, either from the inside or out, but they are not impure when something enters their airspace without touching them. You could hold something in the middle of the pot, and as long as it doesn't touch, it doesn't do anything to a regular pot. But if it were a clay pot, then it would transmit the impurity. Yes, Aaron?
So is this what we were talking about before? They would put things inside the vessel in case like something was dead inside a tent. The vessel would not be impure, but the stuff in it would be protected from impurities too.
Correct.
But if it was a metal vessel, and something impure touched it, though, that would seep through to the inside, right?
All bets are off, indeed. And if you uncover the earthenware vessel, if you make it open, then also it becomes impure. It has to be closed for the purity to remain.
All right, but that's not true of a metal vessel, right?
Correct.
All right.
That which cannot be rendered unclean in wooden things can be rendered unclean in metal things, and that which cannot be rendered unclean in metal things can be rendered unclean in wooden things. That is to say, a vessel that does not have a receptacle is considered simple in Mishnaic terms. A simple wooden vessel cannot become impure. Excuse me. It's just like a dish that you just have a flat board and you are eating off of it. That's what they're talking about. But a simple metal vessel, a flat piece of metal, that could become ritually impure. Unfinished metal vessels that can be used cannot become impure until they are completed. In contrast, an unfinished wood vessel can become impure as soon as it is usable. So again, there are opposite standards for these two different things. Yes, Natan?
Well, I was thinking what you say a few minutes ago about the clay. I don't know why I had the impression that we learned that before, and that the clay, if it's the interior or the exterior, is that there never can be a tame. The interior cannot be tame, correct? And
No, it can become. So the thing about earthenware is once it becomes tame, once it becomes impure, it can never be fixed, except by breaking it.
And redoing.
Exactly, right? So even though it has this extra protection, if it's closed, from things that are touching it that are impure, if it does become impure, like for example, you open it or you put something inside of it, then you cannot just kosher it in any normal way. But a metal pot, if it became ritually impure, you can re-kosher it in the standard ways, depending upon how the pot is used.
But the exterior is still kosher in the earth.
The exterior would still not make like a person carrying it impure. Yes.
So you can put, for example, if someone does cremation, not as the Jewish people, but if someone does cremation and they put everything inside and they close, you can touch the vessel and not be tame.
Yes, although I can't say for sure because I don't know what every cremation vessel is made out of.
But it was one made by
the clay.
the clay.
Right. I mean, because I think some of them are made in very unusual ways. So I'm not an expert on that. But yes, theoretically, yes.
Okay.
Let's continue. Like I said, we're not going to talk about all of these in great detail. When bitter almonds are subject to tithing, sweet almonds are exempt. And when sweet almonds are subject to tithing, bitter almonds are exempt. Bitter almonds are edible when they are small, and they are inedible when they become larger. Therefore, they are liable for tithes when they are small, because that's when they are food, and they are not liable when they are big, because they're no longer food. Sweet almonds are the opposite. When they are small, they are inedible, and therefore exempt from tithes. And when they become larger and edible, they are liable for tithes. Again, just showing us that it's when they are food that they actually count for tithing. Now, you may be wondering, especially as we get into Mishnah 7 and do more of these, why are we doing these strange things, especially that require so much explanation of what they're talking about? Well, again, the Mishnah was written to be memorized, and it was written to be memorized by somebody who had already studied it. So by remembering it, by remembering the text of the Mishnah, you would be reminded of the implications of the Mishnah. So they weren't going to write out every detail, because then it would be impossible to memorize. It would just be too long for most people. But remember, they were expecting you to have studied this, and that you were remembering some of these sentences. A equals B, but B doesn't equal C, as a way of making it easier to remember a pattern. And that's why they are clustered together. Even though we have moved away from the topic of kashrut, they are still following on from something that was considered to be a hook, the different ways of nipping versus slaughtering for things that are opposite. And the editor felt putting more opposites together here would make it easy for the student to remember. This is probably not the way that most of us remember things nowadays. Most of us write a note and write in the book, add extra, have a notebook next with our comments on what we've been studying, and that's great. But that's not how the ancient world worked. People didn't have pens and paper and easy ways to make notes. Most people didn't have a copy of the Mishnah except whatever they had in their brain. So yes, it may be a little frustrating, but this is a very important part of the Mishnah style, and was really important for a couple thousand years for helping students remember what they needed to remember. All right, let's see if we can't finish up Mishnah 7. Again, it's going to bring a bunch of opposites. And then in chapter 2, we'll be back in business with kashrut. Temed, which is a type of drink made from grapes after they've already been squeezed. So it's like made with like the old skins. Before it has fermented, meaning before it's turned to alcohol, it may not be bought with second tithe money, and it renders a mikvah invalid. After it has fermented, it may be bought with second tithe money, and it does not render a mikvah invalid. So as I mentioned, temed is a drink made from grapes that have already been squeezed, meaning the grapes were already squeezed to make wine, and you're using what's left over. Until temed has fermented, the rabbis considered it to be like water. It's not really a drink yet. It's just a icky kind of water. It's not even technically grape juice, because the grape juice is what you squeezed out of the grapes in that press to make the wine. One can buy food and drink with second tithe money, but you cannot buy just water. And you can see that in Maser Sheni, that section of the Mishnah. And therefore, you can't buy temed because it only counts as being like water. Since unfermented temed is water, it also has the power to render mikvah invalid. Right? Only drawn water can invalidate a mikvah. Other liquids do not. Once it has fermented, it is no longer water, and therefore it can be bought with second tithe money because it's now a proper drink, and it does not invalidate a mikvah because it's a drink, not water. Good. Again, we're not going to go into all the details of that because there are a lot of different aspects that are being discussed there, from tithing to mikvah. Brothers who are partners, meaning in an inheritance, When they are liable to pay the kalbon, they are exempt from the cattle tithe. And when they are liable to the cattle tithe, they are exempt from the kalbon. All right, hold on. The kalbon refers to an extra amount that people had to pay over the half shekel that every Israelite was obligated to pay to the temple each year. See Mishnah Shekalim. When sons split their father's inheritance and then shared it in partnership, they are treated as are all partners, and they are obligated to pay the kalbon. Right? They each have to pay their own bonus on the over of the half shekel. In other words, even though at one point all of the money was jointly owned by their father, who would have only had to pay one, they are now regarded as regular partners. If they jointly own animals, they are exempt from paying the cattle tithe, as is always the rules for partners, because they're not actual owners, they're partner owners. However, if they have not yet divided their inheritance, then we treat the inheritance as if it still belongs to their father. In such a case, they are obligated for the cattle tithe because it still belongs to one person, but not for the kalbon, because whenever a father pays the half shekel for his children, he is not liable to pay the kalbon. So they either count as still being his kids or they count as being separate partners, and the ruling for the kalbon and for the tithing will change depending upon where they are. And when A is true, then B is not, and when B is true, A is not. Part 4, whenever there is power to sell, there is no fine, and whenever there is a fine, there is no power to sell. All right, and this is one of those things where if you didn't already study it, you'd have no idea what they're talking about. This section is found in Ketubot 3:8. There are two rights discussed here. The right of a father to sell his daughter as a slave, which was under very strict regulation, but it was a thing, and his right to receive the fine paid out by one who rapes her or seduces her, which was part of the penalty for a person that did that. The father has the right to sell her while she is still a minor, ketana, but not when she reaches the age of na'ara, about 12, when she is what we would call prepubescent in the modern world. At this age, there is no fine levied on the rape or seducer, meaning that there were different types of punishment, but the fine was not one of them. However, once she becomes a na'ara, there is a fine which goes to the father. However, at that age, he now no longer has the right to sell her. Again, we're not diving deep because there's too much there. Whenever there is the right of refusal, there can be no chalitza. This may sound familiar for those of you who did Yevamot with me. And whenever there can be chalitza, there is no longer the right of refusal. The right of refusal refers to a girl's right to annul marriage when that marriage was arranged by her mother or brother because her father had already died. The right of refusal exists only when she is a minor. However, a minor girl cannot perform chalitza, cannot release the brother-in-law from the levirate marriage. Thus, if she was married off by her father and then her husband died before she reached majority age, she cannot perform chalitza until she is majority age. That should be a little bit of a review from Yevamot. And part 6, when the shofar is blown, there is no havdalah, and when there is havdalah, the shofar is not blown. What are we talking about? If a festival falls on the day before Shabbat, the shofar is blown, but there is no havdalah. If it falls on the day following Shabbat, there is havdalah, but the shofar is not blown. How do they recite havdalah then on a festival that follows Shabbat? We would say that the phrase, who distinguishes between holy and holy, ben kodesh lekodesh. Rabbi Dosa says, who distinguishes between the more holy and less holy day. That is not the practice. We just say between holy and holy in our current practice. So, examples of all of this. On Friday evening, right before it became dark, they would blow the shofar 6 times to let people know that Shabbat was beginning. This is not a common practice now, although there are places where they might use a siren or other forms of an announcement to warn people that Shabbat is coming. If this was a day in which they were blowing the shofar to let people know about Shabbat, then it definitely could not be time to recite the Havdalah to separate a holy day from a non-holy day. However, if it was a time to recite Havdalah, then there would be no shofar blasts. On a normal Saturday evening, this is clear. However, it is not always so clear, as we shall see now, meaning this is where it gets wrinkly. If the festival fell on Friday before Shabbat, then they would blow the shofar on Friday evening, as was normal, meaning at the end of the festival. Blowing the shofar on a festival is not prohibited. However, they would not recite any Havdalah at the end of the festival, since the sanctity of Shabbat is greater than that of the festival. We don't do a Havdalah between the festival and the beginning of Shabbat. If the festival fell immediately after Shabbat, the opposite is true. They would recite Havdalah at the end of Shabbat before the beginning of the festival, but not blow the shofar. The final piece of the Mishnah describes how the blessing was recited on Saturday night when a festival begins right after Shabbat. One could not simply recite who distinguishes between a holy day and a profane day, a regular day, because both Shabbat and the festival are holy. Therefore, according to the first opinion, one recites who distinguishes between holy and holy, and Rabbi Dosa differs, but as I mentioned, he does not win that argument. All right.
We don't blow more the shofar.
We do not blow the shofar at the end of at the anticipation of Shabbat.
Huh?
We do not blow a shofar as Shabbat is approaching. But if you lived in a small town, then blowing a shofar to warn everyone that Shabbat was almost starting would be very helpful. But nowadays, if I stood at the synagogue and blew the shofar, maybe a couple dozen people in the neighborhood might hear me. We're very spread out.
But blowing the shofar on the end of the festival, also we don't do it.
Well, again, this would be blowing the shofar at the end of the festival to remind people that Shabbat is about to begin. Because the halakha is a little different between Yom Tov and Shabbat.
Yeah,
you would still want to warn people, for example, with regards to cooking. If you were cooking on the end of the festival for some reason, you better stop because Shabbat is coming up and you're not allowed to cook on Shabbat.
So the shofar key is not for alarm.
Yes, the shofar is a warning here. It's like going, Shabbat's coming, put down your pencils, put down your matches, Shabbat's coming, that kind of thing. Make sense? All right.
Share with us this page, Rabbi.
What's that?
Because if you can share with us, send us the link for this page with all the 1.7, because there's a lot of different, very detailed that you didn't have the time to go over inside. And I need to read again because we went very fast and it was impossible to absorb anything.
I will happily send it to you so that you can review it. Just a second. Aaron, did you want it as well, or do you already have a copy?
Of a copy of the regular version that we've been reading?
Yes.
Yes, I have a copy.
Okay, got it. All right, so we're going to be finished there then. I hope everybody has a good evening, and I will see you all next time when we continue our discussion in chapter number 2.